All right, it's 6 o'clock. So I know some folks have already joined us on the line. Welcome. If you're here for the Montbello Safer Streets meeting, you're in the right place. We are going to give folks just a couple more minutes to trickle in by phone and also through the WebEx application. Sometimes it takes a couple minutes for folks to find their way in. So stay on the line and we'll be getting started in just a few minutes. Hey folks, some folks probably just joined. Again, we're giving folks a few minutes to join us and get online for the Montbello Safer Streets meeting. We're going to give another minute here and then we're going to get started. All right, folks. I think we forgot the elevator entry music for you while we waited for everyone to join us this evening. I'm going to give about 30 more seconds, but then we're going to get started. So for those of you who are joining virtually, you should see our screen with the welcome slide up. And those of you joining by phone, you'll be able to follow along, don't worry. Okay. All right, it's 6:05 and we want to be conscientious of everyone's time. So I'm going to get started. So again, welcome. We're here to discuss the Montbello Safer Streets project, which includes a number of streets in Montbello. We're pretty excited to bring this information to you. It includes Andrews Drive, Uvalda Street, East 51st, and as a transition to Gateway, and Crown Boulevard. So thank you so much for joining us. Even during this crisis, we are working really hard to bring improvements to your community. Due to the current stay-at-home order, obviously our typical mode of outreach is not going to be working. So Dottie is using new and different ways to conduct public outreach. This is about our third public meeting that we're conducting online, virtually, and over the phone. So please bear with us. We think we've worked out the kinks, but if there are technical issues, we will try and work them out on the spot. I'm going to give you a little bit of an orientation about how this meeting is going to work tonight. All right, so we expect our meeting to run till just about 7:30. We're going to have our team provide a bit of a presentation for you and share some of the information about the project. We anticipate that'll take about 45 minutes, but at various points throughout the presentation, we're going to stop and the team will have some polling questions for you, live polling, and also we'll be answering questions from you. So if you have questions during the presentation, you can submit them through that Q&A text box, which you should find on the right-hand side of the screen. If you don't see the actual text box, you might have to click that little caret symbol next to the Q&A to expand that window. We'll have team members monitoring the Q&A window throughout the presentation, and then we will answer your questions during some designated time slots. And I know some of you have joined us by phone this evening, so you won't be able to actively participate in the Q&A itself. But if there are questions that aren't answered today, we definitely encourage you to visit the website. We also have a live hotline, and you can visit either or both of those in the days and weeks following this meeting. So there's a static version of the meeting that you can click through sort of on your own time and submit comments directly. And that's the website is montbellosaferstreetsmeeting.com. So if you want to write that down, you could write it on a pencil right now. It's montbellosaferstreetsmeeting.com, and there's no spaces in that. You can also call that hotline with questions or comments, and the number is 303-524-8500. So I'm going to turn it over now to Francisco. He's our awesome interpreter, and he's going to share some of this information and help folks who would like to join the website and follow along in the translated materials.
Hello, everybody. I will just repeat this information very briefly in Spanish. Para participar en español, puede visitar el sitio montbellosaferstreets.com y seleccionar Ver en Español. Para las preguntas durante la reunión, por favor, usar el chat. Si está siguiéndonos por teléfono, luego puede enviarnos las preguntas en el sitio mencionado. Y finalmente, para toda otra pregunta o inquietud, llamar al 303-524-8500, 303-524-8500. Durante la reunión estaremos dispuestos a responder las preguntas en español. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Francisco. And with that, I also want to introduce the rest of our team. I'm Dana Hoffman. I'm going to be acting as your moderator for the evening. So I'll try and keep an eye on my pocket watch here so that we can stay on time. Sam Piper is the project senior planner. He's a mobility expert, and he's going to help make sure that the ultimate designs for these streets meet the values of the community and also the city-wide. And I don't want to embarrass him, but Sam's wife also works as a teacher in Montbello, so he's got some good perspective from the community as well. We also have Afor Chavez online. She's an outreach specialist, and she's going to be documenting all of your comments as they come in on the Q&A box and gathering up your questions to synthesize and get back to our team so we can answer them really efficiently. Avor's pretty tough, but please do be respectful with your questions and comments in that Q&A box for her sake, but also for our fellow participants. And I also wanted to mention that we have several members of our consultant team on the line. You might hear from them during the Q&A segments. And I think we have Councilwoman Gilmore joining us this evening, and an aide from Councilman Herndon's office as well. So thank you guys for taking the time to join this meeting. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sam. He's going to walk us through some of the project background.
Hi, Dana. Thank you so much for providing that background. And as Dana mentioned, my name is Sam Piper, and I am a transportation planner with the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. And again, to the note that Dana made, we're really excited that you've taken the time out of your schedules to learn about Montbello Safer Streets with us tonight. So thanks again for joining us. And so what is Montbello Safer Streets? Well, it's actually the opportunity to make streets safer in your community, streets that you have all indicated to us consistently that you believe that there are issues and that there's opportunities to make them safer. And so we're here to talk about 4 different projects, 3 of which are very similar and 1 which is a little bit different. So the 4 that are similar are Andrews Drive, East 51st Ave / Gateway Boulevard, Uvalda. The reason that these are similar is these are all of our canal streets. So there's 2 travel lanes in each direction, and then there is the canal in the center of the roadway. So this is what we call the cross section. So how many travel lanes there are, the sidewalk, and in the center canal there. So again, the cross section of all of these roadways is very similar. So information that we talk about tonight related to those streets is all going to be consistent. The one corridor which is different, but again, part of the same kind of package as Montbello Safer Streets is Crown Boulevard. So we've had quite a bit of outreach about Crown Boulevard, and we wanted to provide an update regarding that street specifically. So the presentation tonight is going to provide some background about this program. How did we come here for Montbello Safer Streets? And then it'll talk about some of the observations that we've collected through data and analysis on them. And then we'll follow up with design solutions. So how can we make these streets better reflection of the values that you all have communicated to us through the various planning processes? So with that, I wanted to take a step back and discuss a little bit how we got here. So folks on the phone may have been involved in a recent planning effort called the Far Northeast Neighborhood Planning Initiative. And this was the first plan of a really bold initiative by our colleagues in the Community Planning Department to create a neighborhood plan for every single neighborhood across the city and county of Denver. Many of the neighborhoods today don't have these plans. And so the Montbello community was really fortunate to actually have one of the first of this new initiative of planning efforts. One of the things that we recognized in our partnership with CPD on this planning initiative was that the bicycle and the pedestrian network in Montbello, through our past planning efforts such as Denver Moves Bicycles and Denver Moves Pedestrians and Trails, wasn't really a connected network. And through the outreach process, what we learned from the community was that there's a tremendous value in having it be safer, easier, and more convenient to walk places and to bike. One of the things that the community consistently told us through this planning effort was that there's a lot of children who are walking to school and after school who are riding their bikes and trying to get to parks. There's older folks who are trying to walk across intersections and feel that walking across those intersections can be challenging and difficult. So again, some of the values that we heard through that planning effort, we're going to talk about, and really what it comes down to is roadway design. We can actually think about these streets in a different way to make them safer and easier for kids to walk around and people to bicycle around and people to be able to age and have more mobility options as they get older in this community. So these are themes that we want to consistently talk about tonight. And related to that, one of the things that we've been really assessing is safety. So through the Far Northeast next neighborhood planning initiative, one of the key takeaways was that people felt that there were safety concerns along many of the streets, including 51st, Andrews, Uvalda, and Crown Boulevard, and especially those canal roadways, people telling us that there's speeding that occurs along those roads. And so just wanted to work through some of the observations that we have been able to gain through an analysis of safety data. So on this slide, this is a map of all types of crashes that have occurred between vehicles, bicyclists, and pedestrians in Montbello. And basically, a way to interpret this map is that as the blue blobs get larger, that means that there's more crashes. And as the color turns from a deeper purple to a brighter pink, that means that there's even more or the most crashes concentrated in these specific locations. So really quickly, to help kind of guide understanding of this map, what this map shows us is that there's a lot of crashes happening at Peoria and Andrews and 51st in Chambers. And so folks on the phone or joining us on the webinar, maybe ask yourself, does that kind of make sense with your experience seeing these roadways operate? Another thing that we assessed along these roadways is the travel speed. What we've done is we've actually noted the average speed on all of the corridors we're talking about tonight. So as we kind of walk around the street, starting in the northwest at Uvalda, we see that the average speed is 21 miles per hour. And what that means is that about half of vehicles are traveling slower than 21 miles per hour, but half are traveling faster than that. Many of these roads are posted 25 miles per hour or 30 miles per hour, and also have school zones, and those speed limits drop 20 miles per hour. And so as we kind of walk around, we see that that average speed hovers around 21, pops up to 25 on 51st. And then along some sections of 51st on the eastern side of the roadway, the average speed is actually 28 miles per hour. And again, that means that half of the vehicles are traveling faster than that speed. And again, one of the things we've consistently heard is that there's speeding on these roadways, and the data does substantiate that feeling that people have about how these streets feel when you're driving along them. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about related to that graphic is the traffic volumes. So if we bring that map up just briefly one more time, one of the things that I wanted to point out is how many vehicles these roadways carry. So the AADT is basically just a word for how much traffic travels on that street every day. And that's an equivalent of the number of vehicles that travel along. So on 51st, there's between 8,000 and 7,300 vehicles that travel on that road per day. On Andrews, there's about half of that. So Andrews carries about half the vehicles that drive on 51st. And again, these have the exact same cross section, the same number of lanes. On Uvalda, same number of lanes as Andrews in 51st, we see about 2,000 vehicles. So that's half the number of vehicles that drive on Andrews. So again, it's the same cross section. And one of the observations we had is that they carry different amounts of traffic. So just food for thought. And then when we look at Crown, that's a 2-lane roadway. So 1 lane in each direction. And that carries about 4,000 vehicles per day. So when we start to look at how roadways are designed, we can see that roadways with different numbers of travel lanes can actually carry similar numbers of vehicles. So with that, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into some of the safety issues that we're seeing specifically related to pedestrians. So one of the things that we saw in the previous slide is that crashes for all types of transportation is happening all across Montbello. we're seeing crashes really pop up on every street, especially the streets that we're working on today. Now, when we look at pedestrian crashes, we can see that that pattern changes a little bit. What this slide indicates to us is that we're seeing pedestrian crashes concentrated along Crown Boulevard and at some of our multi-lane intersections where 51st intersects with Crown Boulevard and where Andrews ties into Crown Boulevard. And I actually dug into the crash reports. So this data is provided by the Denver Police Department. And there's crash reports associated with each of the individual crashes. And one of the things that we observed when we dug into the crash report is a really important term, which is called the double threat. And so we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what this term means, because we're going to consistently reference it for the remainder of the presentation. And so what this graphic, and for folks on the phone, I'm going to describe it to you. The double threat is a condition that exists only on multi-lane roadways. So roadways that have 2 or more travel lanes in the same direction. What happens is that a pedestrian may start walking out into a crosswalk, and the vehicle closest to the pedestrian as they walk off the sidewalk stops and yields for that pedestrian to cross the street. Now, as that pedestrian crosses that first vehicle, they're going to be in the blind spot of the vehicle in the next lane over. That vehicle, and in the image that we're looking at here, that person is actually driving down the street and they cannot see that pedestrian in the crosswalk until they get pretty close. And so what we actually see is a pattern of crashes called the double threat, where the pedestrian is struck by the driver in the opposing lane because they did not see them in the other lane. So when I dug into the crash reports, I saw this crash actually happening on our multi-lane roadways where we have crosswalks. And even when we have a stop sign, I was still seeing a pattern of this crash type occurring. And one of the other observations that I gleaned from the analysis of the crash reports is that in some instances, there was actually 2 children hit in the same exact crash by the same vehicle. So multiple minors getting hit in a single crash. And we think it's associated with the 2 travel lanes. And I asked my wife at preparing for this presentation, how many folks are walking to her school, Oakland Elementary, and she said most of them walk to school. So we're seeing a lot of children walking. We have a lot of schools along Crown Boulevard and using Crown Boulevard from the neighborhoods, from Andrews and from 51st. So there's a lot of pedestrian activity. So again, this is just a trend that we saw related to the pedestrian crashes. We think it's related to these multi-lane roadways. So with that, I wanted to switch and then dive in a little bit more into the bicycle data. And with that, I actually wanted to pass it back to Dana and have a quick break where we can ask you a poll. So with Dana, if you could take that back.
Yep. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank you, Sam, for sharing all that information. So Sam was sharing a lot of information about what the data shows on Montbello streets, but we definitely want to hear about your experience with safety on the streets. So for those of you who are able to see the presentation tonight, you should be seeing a poll question pop up on that right-hand side of the screen. And again, if you can't see it, you might have to use that little caret box to expand that poll. And it's a live poll, so once you answer the question, we'll close that poll out in a couple minutes and we'll all get to see each other's responses. So go ahead and take a minute or two to review the question and share your thoughts. So I'm going to read it aloud. You'll see that the question is on the left on the screen and then also on the right where you can click A, B, C, or D. So how concerned are you with the double threat, what Sam just talked about, where pedestrians are not visible to the inside lane vehicles as they cross the intersection on the Montbello Canal streets? Very concerned, as in this is a major issue on these streets. Somewhat concerned, only a little concerned, or this doesn't really seem like an issue to you on these streets. So I'm going to give us about 30 seconds or so to go ahead and input your thoughts on this. And then we'll close that poll out and see what folks are thinking. We appreciate your participation. We'll see how these polls go. I think it's a really good way to get a straw poll, even though we aren't able to be together in person today. Okay. Hopefully everyone has been able to input their answer. So we're going to close that poll and bring up the results. Hopefully. Give our technicians just a couple minutes to bring that up. Okay. So you should now be seeing the results in the corner over there. So it looks like 10 folks indicated they're very concerned, another 6 somewhat concerned, and then some folks who weren't able to participate. So yeah, it sounds like in general, there's quite a bit of concern about this particular problem, which the data bears out. So thank you for trying that out. That's really good information for us to understand your experience on the roadways. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Sam at this point to talk a little bit more in depth about some of these crash issues.
Dana, thank you for passing it back to me. And what we wanted to focus on next was icicle crashes. So similar to the pedestrian analysis that we did, we wanted to focus on were there any patterns in bicycle crashes. And one of the things that we found for bicyclists specifically was that there is definitely a concentration of bicycle crashes in the neighborhood along 51st. So again, we see some crashes occurring at Crown and 51st. But then east of there is where the remainder of the bicycle crashes are concentrated. One of the things that we noticed when we dug into the crash reports is, again, the multi-lane intersections is where other types of bike crashes are occurring. So again, as Andrews meets up with Peoria, and then where 51st travels east and connects with Chambers, we're seeing crash patterns there. And again, as we approach those larger roadways, both Andrews and 51st get wider and with more lanes. And so whenever we have more travel lanes, there's more complications. And so it's pretty typical that we see those types of crash patterns on major streets where that tend to be more complicated. So but that trend seems to be evident in your community as well. And before I pivot away from the crash data, I wanted to call attention to one important point. And it may be something that folks on the phone and that are joining us online are familiar with. And as I noted, the crash reports that we're looking at are for the past 5 consecutive years of data. And it's only the crashes that are actually reported to DPD, which we are reviewing this evening. Research suggests that a lot of crashes that actually occur, so two vehicles get in a crash, or a vehicle and a bicyclist or a vehicle and a pedestrian get in a crash. But say the bicyclist says, "Oh, I think I'm okay. I'm just gonna head home." That crash isn't reported, so that's not going to show up in our data. And so typically we say that the crashes we're looking at through this type of analysis actually underreport the total number of crashes that are occurring. The other thing that these don't get at is near misses. So that's when, as a pedestrian or as a bicyclist or a driver, I think we're all familiar with these instances where you make a corrective action right at the last minute and you're able to avoid that crash, but it almost happened. And so that's a pattern that we see, is that those near misses obviously aren't reported, but it's something to consider that, the data that we have is the best that we have, but there may be other problems that could be emphasized if our data could be improved in the future. So with that, I wanted to go back to kind of the vehicle crash pattern and talk a little bit about how the streets are designed and how we think that they might be contributing to some specific crash types. So again, this analysis focuses across all of the 4 corridors that we're talking about tonight. So that's Andrews Drive, 51st Ave, Uvalda Street, and Crown Boulevard. And as I noted earlier in the presentation, 3 of those streets are very similar in what they look like. They've got 2 travel lanes in each direction and they have a center median. One of the things that we found that's a trend across all of those 3 streets that look very similar is that the most frequent crash type is a front to side collision. And folks might know, yeah, and let's just keep that up for just a second. So folks might know what that crash type is also sometimes referred to as is a T-bone crash. So that's when a vehicle hits another car broadside. One of the things that we recognize on these canal roadways, say you're driving in your neighborhood and you want to cross 51st or you want to cross Andrews in order to get to the median. To do that, you need to cross 2 lanes of traffic. And so every time you cross a lane of traffic, it's what we call you're exposing yourself to a potential conflict. So you're exposed to 1, 2, then you're in the median waiting, and then you cross the other side of the road, 3, 4 conflict points before you get to the other side. And on roadways like this, we tend to see that T-bone crash become the most prominent crash type because that exposure, those points of conflict are greater on multi-lane streets. And again, the data tells us that story. So for our canal streets, about 40% of all crashes on those roadways are the front to side collision or the T-bone collision. The second most prominent crash type, and again, it's consistent across all of the roadways, is the front to rear collision. And we typically find that front to rear collisions are linked to reckless driving and also to speeding. So speeding was one of those things that we mentioned earlier in the presentation. And while those average speeds may have seemed kind of low, generally speaking, what I really wanted to emphasize is that that's the average speed. So 50% of cars, half of drivers are traveling in some instances more than 28 miles per hour. They could be driving, 35, 40 miles per hour. So again, most people are traveling faster than those speeds I talked about previously. And so front to rear collisions, multi-lane roadways, there's less predictability in where you are in the travel lane and where the person in front of you is going to be. So sometimes we see those rear end crashes occurring more frequently on multi-lane roadways. And a major takeaway is that speed, again, is going to be a contributor to that. The ability to stop in a shorter amount of time is directly correlated with the travel speed of vehicles on those corridors. And really quick before we switch, I just wanted to bring up Crown Boulevard, the chart for that, because I just wanted to emphasize that on a 2-lane roadway, again, about 40% of the crashes on our canal streets are front to side. And you can see this number drops on Crown Boulevard, which is a 2-lane street, so 1 lane in each direction, to be less than 30%, about 20% of all crashes. So again, it's the 2 most prominent crash types are still front to side and front to rear, but the proportion of those T-bone crashes is much less on a 2-lane roadway. So with that, I wanted to pass it back to Dana. I know we've been talking about a lot of technical data, and we wanted to have an opportunity for you all to ask questions to make sure this is coming through clearly. So with that, Dana, if you could take it back, and we could go into that Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sam, for covering all that material. So I'm definitely seeing some questions coming in through that Q&A box already, which is great. So we're going to spend a couple minutes answering those. And just as a reminder, you can also put your comments in that box. We won't necessarily be reading those out unless we have time, but we will be analyzing and tallying those up later. So please do provide comments so that we can record those. So again, open up that Q&A box, start entering questions. I'm going to field those and I might pass them along to some other folks as well. And for folks on the phone, again, please visit us afterwards or call the hotline if your questions aren't answered this evening. All right, so with that, I'm going to start reading through some of your questions. Thank you so much for submitting these. All right, so the first one here, scrolling through some, this is great. Okay, so this is a question from Alex. Is there a correlation between travel speed for cars and the accident rate at the intersections? Yeah, that's a really great question, Alex. So in general, we know that travel speeds are very linked to how much injury is associated with an incident. So that's sort of the biggest thing that we're trying to prevent in terms of speed. Speed causes specific kinds of accidents, and it also causes the most likely to cause mortality and is the most likely to cause injury for those on the street. Sam, do you have other thoughts on that question?
Yeah, just definitely speed is a factor, as Dana mentioned, in all sorts of crash types. And as we reviewed the crash data, the prevalence of those rear end crashes, we can make the connection that that's likely related to speed. The ability for someone to stop when someone stops abruptly in front of them is directly related to stopping distance, which again is directly related to speed. So yes, there's definitely a correlation there.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize this is on our Vision Zero website if you haven't visited that, but it's a very striking figure that when a vehicle strikes a pedestrian going about 20 or 25 miles an hour, the likelihood that that pedestrian is killed is, I believe, under 15%. But as you move up to 40 miles per hour, it jumps all the way over 80%. So that's part of why we're talking about lowering speed so much.
Yeah, and Dana, just to make sure we're fully answering Alex's question related to the number of crashes, I just wanted to pull back to our map of crashes. So our data did show that Peoria and Andrews and Chambers and 51st had the highest number of crashes across our network. And again, those are our high-speed roadways that flank Montbello. And 51st and Andrews, as we're exiting, is kind of pulling traffic from the community out. So I think, again, to Alex's question, it also is related to the frequency, because Chambers and Peoria are also the highest speed roadways kind of in the network.
Cool. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. So we had a question from Scott, and he writes, during the pop-up event at Silverman Park, the average speed was compiled at around 35 miles an hour. Can you explain how we get an average speed of 23 miles an hour as we presented tonight? And if the 23 miles per hour average that Dottie is providing does not support that there's an issue with speeding on Andrews or basically anywhere in the community. Yeah, so Sam talked about this a little bit, but it is interesting to see. So there's probably two parts to this answer. And one is that there's different techniques for collecting the data. So at the Silverman Park pop-up that you mentioned, you were using a radar gun. And collecting those speeds over a couple-hour period. It was probably 3 to 4 hours that those speeds were being collected. Well, the counts that Dottie has are collected over a 24-hour period. So there are probably some differences in the speeds that people are going throughout the day. And then that average is collected over that whole period of time. And as he mentioned, the average is the middle, essentially. So there are going to be a lot of outliers. And some of the higher speeds that we see. So our consultants were very helpful here. One of the things that was mentioned was that 20% of people were going greater than 35 miles an hour in the eastbound direction on 51st. And then the 85th percentile, so that's looking at sort of the larger group. So the not just the average, but just bringing into attention the outliers. So that was the 85th percentile was 34 miles per hour over that 24-hour period on 51st. So, well, the majority of vehicles actually are, well, at least half of the vehicles are going at the speed limit or below the speed limit. there's a significant portion that are going above that, especially on like East 51st specifically. All right, let's see. There's a couple more questions here. And we have about a minute left for those. All right, we have a question. It says, great illustration for double threat. Do you think a pedestrian light at the crosswalks would help decrease a vehicle pedestrian crash? Yeah, good question, good question. So I think you're referring to there's a couple different lights that we might use for pedestrians, but one of them is what we call a rapid flashing beacon. And you've seen probably a number of those around the city. And that would be probably the most appropriate solution on a local street, a local collector like these streets that we see here. And that's sort of a button is pressed and then you'll see a intermittent flashing light, and it reminds cars that a pedestrian is actually in the crosswalk at that time and helps them remember to stop. One thing that I point out for the rapid flashing beacons is that our engineers really want to show where it's safe to put these pedestrian flashing lights. And it is in the city's policy manual that they put those on streets that have only one lane in that direction because of that double threat condition. So they don't want to utilize these in a position where it would make the pedestrian feel safe, but then that inner car maybe still doesn't recognize that the pedestrian is there and will ignore those lights. So if we had one lane in each direction, say on Crown with a lot of crossings, there are some locations where it might be appropriate to add a flashing beacon. Or if we were able to narrow the number of lanes on some of these canal streets, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, they would put in those beacons. So there's other treatments when we have more lanes that we're going to talk about in our solution section, but that's when they are most appropriate, is when you have one lane in each direction per the city's policy. Okay, so we're about at 6 minutes. I know there are a couple more questions, but we're going to have at least another one and probably 2 more Q&As, so we'll get through more of those, but I want to make sure that we stay on time. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sam.
Thank you, Dana. So the previous content focused on observations that we have drawn from an analysis of the data, so how the streets operate and some of the data that we have available to us, what story is that telling? And now we wanted to pivot a little bit and talk about, well, how do we make safety improvements to streets? What are some of the tools in our toolbox that can help elevate these streets to be a better reflection of the vision that you all have communicated that you desire for these streets, and essentially that consistent vision to make them safer, to drive along, to walk along, walk across, and to bike along. So this page, we're going to talk about 4 key aspects of street design, which are data-driven and known to increase safety. And the first element is simply making the street easy to use. And what this graphic shows us is clearly marked space for every way that someone might move on this street. So vehicles have a clearly delineated travel lane. Bicycles have a clear space within that bike lane where to ride, and the sidewalks are set back and have that buffer from the roadway, which is parked vehicles. So space along this particular image is very, very clearly marked. And what research suggests is that when roadways have clear space allocated for each way that people are moving through our streets, crash rates do go down. And also when we survey pedestrians and we survey drivers and bicyclists, people actually indicate that it's less stressful. It's less stressful to move through the roadway when everyone kind of has a piece of the street. So one of the key factors that we want to consider in making and kind of reversing some of the trends that we're seeing on our streets today is better delineation of roadway space along the streets. So the next variable I wanted to talk about is slowing speeds. So one of the things that our data did indicate to us, especially as we start to look at those upper speeds, is that we are seeing speeding on these roadways. And again, we have multiple school zones along these streets where the speed limit drops, and we're seeing speeding through those school zones when school pickup and drop off is occurring. So one of the objectives along these corridors would to slow speeds. As Dana mentioned earlier, there's a direct correlation between the severity of a crash, basically how badly someone may be injured, and how fast the vehicle's traveling. Just, it's a matter of force. So there's tools in our toolbox to manage how a street is designed and how that can influence speed. So this image here, you can imagine you're approaching this intersection. One of the tools in our toolbox is to actually visually narrow the travel lane. And so what we're doing in this image, or what this depicts, is that you can use basically painted extensions of where a curb could be built in the future to narrow up the travel lane. And you can imagine if you're driving down the street and you come to this intersection and it's tighter than one that you're used to, there's what we call just more kind of visual friction within the roadway that makes it clear that you should proceed slowly through that intersection. So by visually narrowing corridors, we can achieve slower travel speeds, and especially if we can narrow travel lanes. So when we look at research, those wide travel lanes, those are associated with higher travel speeds, and it makes sense. Our widest travel lanes are typically designated on our highways. So we have those 14-foot travel lanes on our highways, and they're designed to carry cars traveling fast. But our neighborhood streets, we really want to design them to be neighborhood streets, and a true neighborhood street achieves slower speeds. With that, I wanted to talk about the next variable, which is quality over quantity. And what this is related to is travel lanes. And so a theme that we see tonight is that the data is indicating that there's certain patterns that we're seeing associated with the multi-lane roadway. So again, it's our canal streets with 2 lanes traveling in each direction, and our crash patterns, both for vehicles and for pedestrians and bicyclists. And one of the things that we found is that on multi-lane roadways, there's less predictability in who is going to be where. So we talked about the double threat. So again, that term comes up. Who has the right of way is a little bit unclear, or more unclear on a multi-lane roadway than it is on a single lane roadway. And what these arrows on the left depict is just generally that confusion about who has the right of way, who can go first. Now, when we start to think about fewer travel lanes, travel movements along streets get more predictable. There's only so many different turns and stops a vehicle can make. And what we typically see is when we're able to go from the street on the left to the street on the right, we're able to decrease some of the crash types we're seeing on our canal streets, such as the rear ends in those T-bone or those broadside crashes. So quality travel lanes can make streets safer. And the final note that I wanted to make is that we also want to develop complete roadway networks, or what we can think about as safe street networks. And so every roadway within our travel system has a specific function. So our local roadways, you can think about the street that you actually live on, is intended to get people out of their front door and then onto our neighborhood streets. And these collect traffic from again, your street, and they help to move it across the neighborhood, get to our busier roadways like Chamber and Peoria. And then those roadways, which are larger because they need to carry more traffic because they're grabbing it from all the neighborhoods, they're going to funnel that up to 70, and points south. So every street should really be designed to reflect the function that it serves within our network. And one of the observations through the crash data is that in Montbello, when Montbello was developed, these canal streets were constructed, and they are wide streets. and they have multiple travel lanes. And we can kind of see in the data patterns that are resulting from their design. But fundamentally, they are residential streets that are meant to kind of grab traffic from the neighborhoods and move it across. And also, they're the ways that we connect to our parks. They're the ways that we connect to our schools. And one of the observations is the fact that they have multiple travel lanes, something that is a characteristic of a neighborhood street that Montbello has consistently indicated that they value slower speeds, that they value making it easier, safer to cross the street. So it's really important to think about our roadway system as a network, and that some roadways are intended to be larger and have more travel lanes because they need to, and potentially some other roads designed differently given their function in the network. So with that, I wanted to pass it back to Dana, and we can do another poll.
All right, thanks, Sam. Yeah, so for those of you who are joining us through the computer, we have another quick poll question for you. We're all a little more familiar with these, so I'm going to move through it a little quicker. So the question for you is, if your community had money for just one of the safety improvements on the Montbello canal streets, where do you think it's most important to spend that money? Creating dedicated space for bicyclists and pedestrians, say like crosswalks and protected bicycle lanes, address vehicle speeds and reckless driving, fewer or narrow vehicle lanes, facilitating pedestrian crossing, so things like eliminating that double threat and more signage, or I wouldn't spend money on any of the above. All right, we'll give folks about 20 seconds to answer that, and we'll see what we come out with. What are the top priority for you? Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll. We're going to see the responses here. Okay. All right, it's kind of a mixed bag here. A few across the board, folks were interested in any of these solutions, with just a couple more about addressing vehicle speeds. All right, so let's move ahead. I just want to note, we're going to now dive into the potential solutions for the street. We're going to have another Q&A session after that. And then all the questions and comments are going to be published after as well. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sam to talk through some of the specific solutions we're thinking about, the design options for these streets.
Yes, thank you, Dana, for handing it back. And so we have a really exciting opportunity in Montbello to move many of the recommendations that came through the Far Northeast NPI plan. And just wanted to emphasize that a lot of times those types of plans can take decades to actually implement, but the stars have aligned in Montbello, where several of those recommendations can be moved forward in the near term through the Elevate Denver bond, so a bond initiative, a package, which the Denver voters voted on to improve mobility all across Denver, as well as the opportunity to coordinate the installation of some of these projects with our annual paving program. So that's something we try to do all the time, implement recommendations from our plans. So again, this is a real great opportunity to have a discussion about how these streets could look in the relatively near future. So when we look at the canal streets today, they have a very consistent layout. So when we look at the number of travel lanes and the parking lane and the sidewalk, we see that there's two 11-foot travel lanes, an 8-foot parking lane, and then what we call an attached sidewalk. So there's no buffer between where pedestrians are walking and where that parking is and the travel lanes. Generally across the canal streets, we see that parking use is really low. So what sometimes ends up happening is that outside travel lane can actually look like a 19-foot lane, so a very wide travel lane. And as I noted earlier, wide travel lanes tend to be associated with higher travel speeds. And that's even more true off of the rush hour period. So later at night when when traffic's really low, those wide lanes can contribute to even higher speeds. Again, we have a lot of stop controlled intersections, and we have crosswalks here, and folks can understand what it's like to kind of drive along these streets. I know when I've had to go up to Montbello to drop things off to my wife, working at the school there, I've noticed that these intersections can be awkward. You know, who has the right of way, who goes first, and you kind of leave it up to folks looking at each other and giving visual cues of, okay, you go first, I'll go after you. So again, not something that we really strive for in roadway design. We really want the roadway design to be very clear who has the right of way. So again, just some awkwardness that I'm sure other folks are familiar with along these streets. So with that, I wanted to talk about some design solutions that get at some of the issues that we've heard, and through the polling questions, you know, address vehicle speeds, creating dedicated space for pedestrians and facilitating the crossing of pedestrians. That's something that you have all just indicated that you do value. And so this is what we're calling option A. And I just wanted to talk through briefly what the elements of this design are. And so if we're kind of looking again at the roadway layout, this design maintains 2 travel lanes. And then, as I mentioned before, parking along the canal streets is generally pretty low. And we can kind of repurpose that space into a dedicated bike lane, which is a unique type. It's called a protected bike lane. And so it actually has a vertical physical barrier between where the bikes would ride and where the vehicles would be driving. So we've got different elements for that, but this image kind of depicts what that could look like. And so some of the observations about this design option that we see is it does provide that dedicated space for bicyclists, which is again something the polls just indicated is valuable. It provides more separation between where pedestrians are walking on the sidewalk and the vehicle lanes. It does maintain 2 travel lanes, so 2 travel lanes are kept. And so while it does provide that dedicated space for bikes, we still think that that double threat issue, which I talked about earlier, and we're just going to revisit really, really briefly right now in case there's some folks that have joined us later. So let's bring that image of the double threat back up. And we just wanted to reemphasize that that issue will be, for lack of a better word, maintained with this design. We're still going to have to cross 2 travel lanes as pedestrians. And again, that term, as very briefly, in case folks just joined us, is that the pedestrian is blocked by the vehicle in the near lane, and we tend to see patterns where the pedestrians could be struck by the driver that we see in this image here. And with that, because we have 2 travel lanes that are going to be more narrow, we do think we're going to help to reduce some of the speeding issues. But on this roadway, think about it, if you're driving and you want to go a little bit faster, you can pass the slower moving car, get around them. And so that movement will still be able to be made on this. So we think that the ability to maintain speeding purely through the roadway design is potentially less than another option that we want to talk about next. So again, the key elements is that protected bike lane, repurposing the parking lane, and then having 2 dedicated travel lanes. So with that, let's switch over to the second option. And so we're calling this option B. And so the similarities between the option I just discussed and this is that we have that protected bike lane. And the differences are, so again, that protected bike lane is where bicyclist has a dedicated space to ride, which is physically separated from the roadway by a vertical barrier. And the differences is that we would, instead of repurposing the parking lane, we'd actually make a wider buffer and we would repurpose one of the travel lanes. So we would go from 2 travel lanes to 1 travel lane along this corridor. And what this option also introduces is that while there may not be significant parking demand along many of our canal streets, we do find that there's demand for parking along some segments, such as near parks, or if there's school loading and pickup. So what this option provides the opportunity is we could install more parking if the community determined that was, or keep parking if the community determined that was something that they value. And one of the biggest differences here is, again, we've talked a lot about speed this evening, and folks consistently tell us that they're speeding on the canal roadways. One travel lane, what we say is that the slowest car helps to determine how the rest of the cars behind them drive. And you can imagine this, you're on a roadway and someone is driving slower on a one lane, one direction road, and there's a bunch of cars that kind of stack up behind them. So we think that this will help to manage that speeding issue most effectively. The other thing that this would include is at the intersections, you can imagine if you're walking off of that sidewalk and you want to cross the travel lane, you're going to, we're not going to have that double threat issue anymore. We find that it's much more predictable when we have one vehicle on the approach, and then that pedestrian or that bicyclist can make eye contact and then cross the road. We eliminate the double threat issue with this design option. Now, I think folks might be asking themselves, well, how do we go from 2 travel lanes to 1 travel lane and still maintain an efficient roadway? And so we understood that folks might have that concern. And so we did our due diligence and we developed traffic analysis. So we actually looked at the busiest time of the day, so rush hour. And our consultants who are joined with us on the call today, they actually did analysis to determine basically how much longer would it take for you to get through a typical intersection along one of these canal roadways during the busiest time of the day. So we kind of looked at the worst case scenario. What the traffic analysis told us was that if we went from 2 lanes to 1 lane, the change in how long it would take to get through that intersection would just be about 3 seconds. So just to kind of give you a sense of that, that's 1, 2, 3 seconds is the change. And when we look at roadway design, every decision we make typically has a trade-off. So if we were to think as a community that this option was desirable, that would be really the trade-off that we're looking at. A slight change in how long it took to get through during, again, the busiest time of day. So every other time of the day, it would be even less. It'd essentially not be noticeable change. So, and then the trade-off is that 1 travel lane, and the benefits is the dedicated bike lane. You have the parking if you need it, and you have essentially a safer intersection design. And we've consistently heard at DOTI the desire from the community to have more marked crosswalks. And our engineers in the organization are more comfortable marking crosswalks on a roadway like this than a multi-lane roadway due to the double threat issue. So with that, I wanted to pass it back to Dana to see if she could walk through a comparison of those for you.
Okay, I'm back. Sam, thank you so much for walking everyone through those options. So what you have on the screen now in front of you is essentially just a summary of both the physical condition of the roadway with option A and option B compared to the existing condition, and also some of those benefits and potential trade-offs for each of these. Obviously, each does have some significant benefits and also some significant trade-offs. And I just want to note that this isn't necessarily what I'd call a black and white decision. And what I mean by that is that we could do a mix and match, essentially. So while there's benefit to some consistency on the road, we won't want to be switching back every block. We could, for example, go with option A on 51st Avenue since it carries more traffic, and then go with option B for Andrews Drive and Uvalda since they carry less traffic. So those are definitely options. These are our 2 primary options, but there's a lot of opportunity to mix and match. So keep that in mind as you sort of weigh these options in your head and decide what's best for your community. So that with that, I'm going to turn this to another question and answer period. Again, I wanted to remind folks that you can feel free to write down your comments in the box. I've heard that we already are getting some calls in to the hotline, so we'll be all noting this down. I already have some in the inbox, but keep on writing them. So for instance, there's a question from Veronica. It says, not all people will go the speed limit. Thoughts on speed bumps or dips to reduce speed? Yeah, this is a really good question, Veronica. So Sam talked about sort of the toolbox of solutions, and some communities actually do a speed hump or bump, slightly different variations on the design to help reduce speed. The city of Denver doesn't currently use speed humps as part of our toolbox. And that's because of some significant downsides for this particular treatment. We get a lot of concerns from our emergency responders about speed humps. They have to be extremely carefully designed. And then it also can hinder snow and plow clearance and lead to some ice buildup on the roadway. So those are some disadvantages that have caused the city to decide not to install them. Another reason is that typically to be effective, you have to have quite a few in a row. And that's because if there's just one or two, studies have found the typical response is that folks will definitely slow down for the speed bump itself, but then rev their engine to sort of make up for that lost time. So you have to implement these in large series. So because of the other downsides and the number that you would have to install, typically we're relying on some of these other very proven methods, other toolbox options, like those bulb outs that Sam was talking about, protected bicycle lanes, so having that other infrastructure in the roadway as cues for vehicles to slow their speeds. So there still may be those folks who just ignore all of our symbols, but by and large, cars are going to be taking cues from these kinds of tools that we put on the street, like the bollards, like the narrowing of the roadway with the paint, things like that to really help slow people's speed. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. So I see, as the bike lanes are installed on 51st, can the signage get fixed to make sure people have the correct speed limits? Because it shifts between 25 and 30 miles an hour, it's confusing. Per the lack of signage eastbound, would 25 mile an hour be, and westbound per sign be 30 miles per hour? Yeah, that's a great point. It does shift, and the signage could definitely improve. So thank you for that comment. The signage shows that I think there's actually 3 shifts because there's a school zone, and then as you move into the neighborhood, it's 25 miles an hour, and as you approach Chambers, it's 30 miles an hour. So that can be confusing, and I think we can definitely, as part of this project, install more clear signage, have better and more of those miles per hour signs, so that as people are paying attention to those, they know what speed they should be going. There's another question here from Pam. Considering the amount of traffic on 51st and the amount of congestion at 51st and Crown, and that also noting it's a 6-way stop sign, what is the criteria for acquiring a stoplight with pedestrian signals? Yeah, so Pam, this is a good question. I might turn this back over to Sam, but I think what you're asking about is whether we would ever install a traffic signal here. Sam, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so I'm going to start, and then if I could actually ask Evan to help answer this question, because again, I'm a transportation planner and I can describe basically what a traffic signal warrant is. And Evan, maybe you could be on deck to kind of provide some more details to that. But generally speaking, we need to meet strict criteria in order to determine if we can implement a traffic signal at a specific location. And that's related to the traffic volumes and the speeds and the number of crossings. So Evan, could you provide a little bit more clarity from an engineering standpoint about what that term means for folks?
Yeah, so there's about 7 different traffic signal warrants, and they'll range from volume data, speed data, and then safety is one of the considerations as well. So if there's a higher incidence of certain safety issues at an intersection, then you're more likely to put it in. basically it's a 7-step process that you go through if one's needed. And political, input is definitely considered as well. It's not always the best solution. There's sometimes cheaper and easier things you can try in the meantime before you put in a signal. So because obviously signals aren't cheap. So it's a tool in the toolbox, just like some of the other things we're talking about, but there's a process that has to be gone through before it can be decided to go forward.
Thank you for that, Evan.
Thanks, Evan. We still want to cover just a few more things in this presentation, so I'm just going to have one more question right now, and then we'll answer more questions at the end. So we have a question from Alex. Has the issue of equity been addressed when considering these potential changes? Socioeconomic conditions of the neighborhood. Will the residents benefit from these changes? That's a really good question, Alex. I've worked for the last 2 years in Montbello, and it's very clear to me that historically there has definitely been equity issues. And part of the reason that we see these very wide streets in Montbello is that it was built out in the 1950s, which was a very car-focused time. And when we went looking to identify the highest priority locations to put projects, we were evaluating that against what we call communities of concern. And communities of concern look at a bunch of sort of equity criteria like income, like race, to evaluate what communities are of most need in Denver. Montbello is one of those communities. And I was really excited about this project because these protected bicycle lanes and these vertical protection with buffers are the sort of latest and greatest. It's sort of the cutting edge of the work that we're doing in Denver to really, really facilitate the focus on safety, to push through and find those safety solutions. So we're focusing on just a couple neighborhoods where we put these in. We did a couple sort of pilots downtown to put in protected bicycle facilities. But Montbello is one of just a few communities where we're looking at putting in sort of a network all at once. So multiple streets getting these safety improvements. So I think it's not everything, but this is a big step to help bring that equity lens and really bring Montbello the kinds of treatments that we'd like to see to improve safety here. All right, I know there's a few more questions that are in the queue, but we want to make sure that we talk through the treatments on Crown. But before we get there, I believe we have a polling question to ask the big kahuna here. One of the big reasons why we're here tonight. So you'll see that poll popping up on your screen. So based on the information that Sam shared about these options, what is the best option for the Montbello Canal streets from your perspective? There's some options here. I want option A for some of the streets and option B for other streets. I want option A for all the streets. I want option B for all the streets. I prefer to keep the existing the existing condition on these streets, or it's fine if you don't know or if you haven't made up your mind yet. So we really definitely want your thoughts on this to help guide us on a direction. So we'll leave this open for, again, about 20 seconds. Please share your thoughts. And then we're going to spend a couple minutes talking about Crown, so shifting direction a little bit. And then again, we'll have Q&A at the end of the presentation. Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll. Let's see what folks are thinking so far. Okay, we have just a couple responses in, but it looks like 7 folks of the total, which is the highest number, prefer option B for all the streets. And 2 folks prefer option A for all the streets, but a lot of folks haven't answered, and that's fine. If you do want to share more of your thoughts on this as you really digest it, we encourage you to use the webpage. But for now, I'm gonna shift this back over to Sam to talk about Crown. So we've been focusing on the canal streets, but we are also looking at some changes on Crown Boulevard.
Thank you, Dana. So as Dana mentioned, we had talked a lot tonight about our canal streets. So those have 2 travel lanes in each direction and then the center median. Crown Boulevard looks completely different than that. That's more of our typical local street that has 1 travel lane in each direction. And right now, the street has a bike facility type that we used to install in Denver, but we no longer do. And it actually has kind of a funny name. It's called a party parking lane. And the reason is the parking lane typically isn't that busy. So a bike can ride in it, but if you have a party, the parking gets more busy. And then the bicyclist kind of has to veer out of that lane every time there's a parked car. And the community indicated to us all across Denver that was really not comfortable. So we've been actively changing and upgrading that type of bike facility wherever possible. So we have that opportunity on Crown Boulevard, and we've talked quite a bit about this route with your community. And actually, there was a time when we were having a discussion about maybe a protected bike lane, similar to what we're proposing on the canal streets on Crown Boulevard. And the community told us, that really isn't what we desire. That's not what we need. And so we listened to that. So we got a lot of positive feedback to change our momentum and focus on the canal street with that type of bike lane, and then see if we could do something more simple on Crown Boulevard itself. And so Crown Boulevard, what we've pivoted to is a conventional bike lane. So that's the image on the left. That's a striped bike lane, and that would fit next to the parking lane, and parking would be maintained on both sides of the roadway. And there are some instances where no parking is actually allowed along one side of the street, or there's instances where there's no houses fronting a specific block, and there's really, really low parking demand. One of the things that we're proposing is that we could actually have that space converted into a wider bike lane and do a buffered bike lane. So we just wanted to give a quick update of where we're at with the design for Crown Boulevard. So again, the majority of the corridor, we'd be able to keep 2 travel lanes in both directions and keep that parking. And then we have this opportunity to install a buffered bike lane where either parking is restricted along subsegments or where the parking use today is very, very low. So with that, I wanted to pass it back to Dana and see if we want to talk a little bit more about Crown, or if we want to go forth and talk about next steps.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I think we want to show the timeline, but folks who have questions about Crown, please put them out there in the Q&A box, and we'll answer them after this. But I did want to share, if you want to pull up that timeline so that you know where we're tracking for these projects. So as you can see, we've had a number of stakeholder meetings as early as January and March, and I actually think there were 1 or 2 before that. And then starting from today and over the next few weeks, we'll continue to be collecting comments and questions on these design options. And that's going to help inform us as we move into selecting a preferred design for each of these streets based on what the community is telling us. So around the beginning of June, we'll come back to you with those preferred designs that we've put more detail to. And we do anticipate at this point that open house may also be virtual, but we'll be watching the state and city guidance to determine that. And we also welcome your comments about how this meeting went and if there are other elements that you'd like to see if we are going to have to remain virtual. So going further on that timeline, we do have the opportunity sort of late this summer into fall to coordinate the installation of whatever that preferred design is on East 51st and Gateway as our repaving teams come through. So they're planning to come through at the end of the summer, and that's a great efficiency that we can utilize to put them in. And that's also when we would come in and install the bike lane infrastructure on Crown Boulevard. So we're also anticipating coordinating the paving of the other streets with the installation of whatever the preferred treatment is. So we anticipate Andrews and Uvalda treatments to go in 2021 and 2022. All right, so that's the timeline. And that's essentially all of our presentation materials. So we're going to spend the rest of the meeting responding to your questions. We can take your comments. And again, all of these comments and questions are going to be published. This live meeting will be posted on the webpage and will be a YouTube video. And then we'll be coming back to you in June. But for the next couple weeks, we'll be taking comments and questions. So I do encourage you to share this with your friends or family that wasn't able to make it tonight, so that they can also view and share their thoughts. So let's jump into question and answer. So there were a couple sitting in there before that I'm gonna pull up, and then we'll keep on running through. All right, so there's a question from Scott. So where all the pedestrian accidents were happening on Crown, which is not a double threat condition, what is the reasoning for all the pedestrian accidents along Crown? Is it related to children going to school? Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. And I think you were looking back at that early map that we showed where pedestrian incidents are. And you are correct. There are a number of pedestrian involved incidents on Crown. And in this case, we know that it's not linked to double threat, but from looking at those incidents, we do see that there are a significant number of them, or a higher number than we would expect on any typical street where they are minors being hit, and that a lot of them are also mid-block. So that's one of the things we're focusing on Crown, is making sure that we have a good number of crosswalks, and also that we're implementing some other signage in relation to those crosswalks. And one of those is what we call an in-street pedestrian sign. And this is a fairly new treatment for our city as a toolbox, but it's essentially a sign that has a pedestrian crossing that's right in the middle of the street, right where that yellow line is. It's pretty visible, so it's a good reminder for folks that they need to stop at the crosswalk under the law. So we're looking at installing 1 or 2 of those on Crown, as well as the bicycle lane. And Sam, do you have anything to add for that?
Yeah, I just wanted to note that several of the crashes along Crown Boulevard actually did occur at our intersections with the multi-lane street. And some of them were related, such as at Andrews or at 51st, with that double threat condition. So those were a contributor to that. And then Scott, to your other point about the composition of the types of people involved in those crashes, one of the things we did notice was that a significant proportion were minors, so likely children walking to school. So double threat seemed to be part of the pattern, and then to Dana's point, there's other contributing factors there, and then minors did seem to be overrepresented in crashes.
Okay, thanks, Sam. All right, here's another question. It says, given that speeding is an issue, I understand that, but traffic jams around the schools will cause a greater delay than 3 seconds, right? Yeah, that is sort of intuitive, right? That while we see a lot of traffic during that peak period around the school time. And what we did look at when we conducted that modeling that Sam was talking about, so where that 3 second delay figure comes from, those models are conducted always at the peak period. So they actually run a 24-hour, I told you the counts are collected over a 24-hour period. But then we see exactly in that 24-hour peak period, that 24-hour period when those peak times are. And you're correct, the peak period on Crown and also throughout Montbello is during that morning rush hour and also that time period when folks are dropping off students. And it is that time period that those vehicle numbers that we assess the delay. So in this case, that 3-second delay, according to the model, would be at the highest traffic time during the morning, during school drop-off. So because the street is oversized, we don't believe, again, that we would see a major delay. I hope that answers the question. I know that seems somewhat technical, but it is collected during the peak time. All right. Let's see. All right, I'm seeing if there are other questions coming through here. All right, I see some other comments from folks. We can read through some of these comments if we don't have more questions. We have about 5 minutes left in the presentation. We're happy to stay after that as needed. All right. So I think we'll go ahead and read through some of your comments. And then I wanted to remind folks again that you can utilize the web page, and you can also utilize the call number, the hotline. And I did see some comments and questions about wanting to have more of a conversation, and that's really good feedback for us. This is a new format for us, and we wanted to make sure that we could address everybody. But we'll look towards having options for folks to be a little more interactive as we move forward. Okay, so I see some comments here coming in. So here's a comment from Pam. 51st is not a good street for the narrow or single lane traffic because the amount of traffic. Narrowing our street will cause friction on 51st at Crown. Thank you for that comment, Pam. We're definitely going to take that into account. Okay. Let's see. Waiting for some other comments here to come in. Okay. Yeah, I see another comment here. Would you consider the traffic light to control traffic along the lower/consistent speed limit both ways, keeping existing conditions with the addition of bike lanes and traffic lights? We do think that one of these two options will help provide a lot of benefits on these streets, but neither of them actually precludes the installation of a signal. A signal would require sort of that engineering analysis that Evan talked about. So we can conduct that at certain intersections. It is unlikely probably at streets with the volumes that we see on these roadways that they would qualify for a traffic signal, but I do think moving forward, we could look at specific intersections as needed. You can always use the 311 hotline if there are specific intersections. Or you can provide that comment to us too. It sounds like 51st and Crown we could look at. I see another question here. Will you provide this presentation in Spanish to share with other residents? Yeah, great question. So if you visit the web page, so that's montbellosaferstreetsmeeting.com, it gives you the option to click the Spanish button or Espanol button right as you enter the web page. And in that case, you can view all the content in Spanish. And we also are able to translate all of these questions and comments if folks would like, so that you can see what other community members are doing. All right, I see another question. We have a couple minutes left here. Oh, okay, that's just a repeat question. Yeah, so will this be provided in Spanish to share with other residents? Yes, yeah, we will have that online version, which presents all the materials in Spanish. And we can also share questions and comments. Okay. So I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment. Sure, there's lots of comments. We'll be reading some of those. Okay. All right. So thank you all for joining us. We appreciate your patience. Again, you can see that after the meeting, you can visit that webpage or the hotline. And we look forward to continuing this conversation with you over the next couple weeks and months, and then coming back to you in June with an open house to share where we're going. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you very much.